Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time before European colonization to the present. The startup National Museum of American Religion is working to build a museum in the nation's capital that will share the story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans and thus America itself. Join our host, Chris Stevenson, for Season 2 of our podcast series, Religion in the American Experience, as we follow scholars deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released every Monday on Apple Podcast and Spotify. Register for notifications on our website, www.storyofamericanreligion.org, under the Sign Up tab.
Welcome. I'm your host, Chris Stevenson, of the National Museum of American Religion, which is dedicated to telling the profound story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion. From what I saw on TV last week as it was happening, and from what I've read in the newspapers after, religion was very present at the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. Jesus Saves signs, prayer groups, a large wooden cross on the East Plaza, and from an article in the paper the next morning, quote, beneath streaming flags, people loudly exhorted Jesus and chanted USA, close quote. We are here this morning to learn the lessons of history, specifically the history of religion and politics in the United States, from a panel of leading American scholars, and offer these lessons to the public so that we can all better understand and react to the violent occupation of the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. Our panel consists of, and panelists, please raise your hands when your name is called so our attendees can match name to face. Marie Griffith, Director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis. Jamil Drake, Assistant Professor in the Department of Religion at Florida State University. Lerone A. Martin, Associate Professor of Religion and Politics, also at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. Hasia Diner, the Director of the Goldstein-Gorin Center for American Jewish History at New York University. And, last but not least, Amy Black, Professor of Political Science at Wheaton College. Thank you, panelists, so much for participating, especially considering your very, very busy schedules at the beginning of this semester. Viewers, before we begin, and as a thank you for joining us this morning, please go to download.storyofamericanreligion.org for a free gift that captures a towering national figure in 20th century American history and one who occupies a very important place in the story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion. Also, attendees, you may submit questions in the Q&A feature, which we will answer via email. First, panelists, to frame our discussion, would each of you give a brief statement, 60 seconds or less, that describes the relationship between religion and politics in the United States over its 244-year history? Marie, let's go ahead and start with you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Chris, and good to see you all. You know, religion is not a simple thing, as we know, and there are a lot of narratives today about America being founded as a Christian nation or not, and I guess I first want to dispel that myth. America was not founded as a Christian nation, and really the relationship between religion and the state, or religion and politics, was always fraught. We know that the founding fathers thought very hard and argued a lot over the role that the church should play in state politics. And eventually Jefferson, of course, and Madison in particular, created a certain kind of separation, a relationship that would seek not to corrupt either the state or religion. They were concerned about both and felt that politics could corrupt religion, religion could corrupt politics. And this is a debate that we have continued to have ever since, because of course people's religious beliefs and commitments and practices do influence their political views, and it's impossible to completely separate these things. So we've created this kind of paradox. The founders created it, we live with it on into today.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's jump over to Jamil. Jamil, can you give us your elevator speech?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. No, just to piggyback off of Marie, first of all, thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be on this panel. Just to piggyback off of Marie, I think in some ways, particularly in light of the events that happened January 6th, the relationship between religion and politics really is demonstrated through this issue of race, right? And, we can't talk about American religion apart from race. Religion and race, are co-constitutive, right? In other words, they inform one another, excuse me. And so whether we're looking at slavery, whether we're looking at the Civil War, whether we're looking at Reconstruction and, down to the 20th century, race is in some ways a part of American religion and in particular white supremacy. So I'll just kind of stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jamil. Amy, let's come up to you and get your elevator speech here.
Sure. And echoing the others, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be a part of this conversation. When I think of religion and politics in the United States, the first thing that comes to my mind that it's just always been a central tension between religion and politics. And that word tension, I think, is another really important word. Religion has always informed politics. Politics has always informed religion. And it's not been a simple marriage between the two. As Marie mentioned, I do think it's important when we look at our religious history to see the foundation of this unique idea of separating institutions of church and state. But also, as we go back, as I like to remind people, we start with the irony of when we have colonists, many of them fleeing religious persecution or concerned about religious freedom. And then they come and they set up colonies. And the first thing they do is establish a religion. And so that's just, I think, a good example of how this is just mired in irony and paradox from the beginning. A couple other things I would just think about is just the fact that Americans have used religious appeals throughout history, I think sometimes as a source for good and sometimes as a source for ill. And so religion is often a part of our conversation in how we talk about politics in the United States. And also, particularly, I'd say more in modern times, but even as you look throughout history, we've often seen distinctive patterns of how religion informs politics, kind of by religious group. Not that people walk exactly in lockstep, but that there are a lot of relationships between distinctive religious groups and how they interact with or don't interact with politics.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Hasia, let's turn the time over to you for a minute or so.
Okay, again, thank you. And really lovely to be with everybody here. So there are so many things one can say, and I'm sure much of this will come out in the course of our conversation and beyond. But first, religion has always been part of American politics, well back to the era of earliest settlement. And those two cannot be analytically divorced from each other. And American elections, local, state, national, have always had the echoes of a religion, louder or a bit more subdued, but always there. And as a historian, to me, my first reaction to the question was the election of 1928, and the first time there's a Catholic candidate for the presidency, and the kind of earthquake that inspired. So religion and politics, let's call them bedfellows. Secondly, there's another part to this story, which is religion and governance. And that in some ways had channels that could be appealed to, namely legislative and judicial, to try to iron out some of the inconsistencies that were inherent even in the First Amendment between the free exercise and the non-establishment. So it's also had a governmental aspect to it. Thirdly, I would say that there's been no important American issue, social, economic, cultural, without a kind of religious angle to it. I don't care what it was, there was always religion there. My penultimate point, all of these religious communities or faith communities, they tend to be called now, all were responding to the same large forces: industrialization, urbanization, the cultural critique of the post-war period with the civil rights movement, the student movement, liberation. Okay, and then finally, to echo Jamil, you can't get away from race, and essentially race as white supremacy is an American religion. It's not independent. It is an American religion. It's what I don't want to say most, many white Americans have believed in more than anything else.
Okay, Hasia, thank you. Lerone, you're going to have the last word on these elevator speeches.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. I thank you for having me, and I agree with everything my colleagues have said. I will simply add that I think it's important for those who are more on the liberal side of the scale, who, starting with Marie's point, will say, yes, America was not founded as a Christian nation. Therefore, let's just get rid of religion and remove religion from the public sphere. I think it's important for that audience to know that religion is something that we don't really want to get rid of in the public sphere, because if we think about religion as something that is simple as orientation or worldview, people bring their worldviews, their orientation to the world, what they believe is good, what they believe is moral, what they believe is right. They bring that with them into the voting booth when they go to the polls and they go to vote. And so this is not something we want to completely remove from our republic. We want people to have notions of good and notions of right and wrong and propriety. And we want those to maintain a place in the public sphere. So I would say that my thought about religion and politics in the long story of America is simply that religion has been a motivating factor. It has been a motivating factor and a shaper and an influencer of how people think about the world and how they think about what is good and what is right. And people bring that with them in their political organizing, and they bring that with them to the voting booth. And that's the way that I've often thought about religion. And sometimes in this country, as my colleagues have pointed out, that has provoked people to engage in ideas that we look back in history and see as good or progressive. And other times we look back and see that some of these folks were motivated to do things that we now see in hindsight have been very detrimental and terrible to other human beings and to the nation as a whole. So that's the way that I think about the story of religion in American politics.
Okay, great. I think this has been super helpful to frame our discussion for the listeners. I want to now inch closer to January 6, 2021. But before I do, I want to take a max of 3 to 4 minutes, and not everybody has to respond, but I think this would also help us frame our discussion. In the United States, what rules, official or cultural, govern religion's participation in politics and political participation in religion? Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time, and we all don't have to answer, but if 2 or 3 of you have something to say here that would help listeners in their framing here, please do so.
Well, I guess I can start with a few thoughts. I think it's important, excuse me, that at least we have to sort of see this history of individualism in the United States. And so when we look at religion in American politics, religious institutions have a place, but so much of it has been religious people, individuals acting based on their religious views. And so that is in some ways very good, I think, because it gives room for disagreement between religious communities, and that we see that not everyone acts in lockstep, but that individualism can also mean that people can kind of go off in their own direction. So we don't have as focused, I'd say, as institutional connection between religion and politics. I also think when we think about these things, just the reminder that faith is a powerful motivator of political action and has been in the United States throughout our history. So I don't know if that's exactly a rule, but I think it's an important sort of precept. Maybe we should expect people to rely on their faith when they think about politics, and that we should allow them to be a part of that conversation.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Hasia.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are rules and then there are rules. And some of the rules are embedded in the legal system. For example, tax-exempt status for religious institutions. Theoretically, the clergy are somewhat stymied from endorsing political candidates from the pulpit, and so many others which come out of the non-establishment clause. So those are kind of rules that have some level of law behind them, but all the other rules are absolutely open for debate. And whose idea of this is where my religion should stop and your freedom, your rights should begin, completely up for grabs. And I feel like I have lived long enough to see the rules changing under my feet. And in a way, as somebody who grew up in one of the sort of small religious communities in the United States, seeing the vast changes about those rules in everyday life and in the public sphere. And in many of these cases, I say to myself, my God, I can't believe this is happening. So those rules are totally out there.
Okay, great. I saw two hands, Marie and then Jamil.
Sure. Yes, I love these points together, Amy and Hasia. And I think that going back to the way the rules, where they're invisible, where we were not even thinking about them, or the assumptions. For me, I'd like to bring in gender, because I think that gender and sexuality are great examples of this. Our laws, our foundational laws about marriage, are based on Christian concepts of subjugation of women to male authority. And the marriage laws in this country, as we know, going back all the way, we're based on that foundation. And yet we think of marriage, or sometimes we think of it as a secular institution. It's just embedded in our laws. And I think so many of the fights we've had since 1920 and Margaret Sanger and the birth control movement have been about gender and sexuality norms based in Christianity, and that have sort of roiled our politics over and over again. And that's had to do with the birth control movement, with abortion, particularly with homosexuality and same-sex marriage. Some of the key moments in our history in conflicts between religion and politics have been about women's rights and the rights of LGBTQ people and abortion, all of which are gendered ideas. And yet we don't tend to argue about them in the public square as if they are religious. So I think there's a great example of what Hasia is describing as the kind of the rules that we don't even think of, or the assumptions, and where religion is being brought in ways that a lot of people disagree with. So I think that's important to keep, at the forefront here too.
Helpful. Jamil, take 30 seconds and then we're going to move on.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of what was just already been said, though, we got to think about how the state seeks to sort of manage and legitimate certain religions over and against others. So in other words, when we think about what is good religion and bad religion, it is based off of the state's sort of preference. So when we talk about dissent, in sort of African American religion. This is not legitimate religion, as we saw with Kelly Loeffler and others in Georgia. This is not good religion because it's in some ways challenging the state. So whatever the state says is good religion, whether we're talking about Hobby Lobby or whatever, over and against bad religion, somebody else's religious freedom is somebody else's religious oppression.
Okay. Thank you. Lerone, did you have a hand up before we move on? No. Okay, good. All right. So now let's dig deep into the historical record and begin approaching last week. I want to take this generation by generation. So between 1960 and 1990, what are some of the most significant events and movements on the, what I call the American religious political landscape, and what are their ramifications? Again, according to the historical record, let's start, Lerone, with you. You're on mute, Lerone.
I'm sorry, I missed you for a second. My service went away for a second. I'm sorry, I missed part of the question.
Okay, let me reread that. So between 1960 and 1990, what are some of the most significant events and movements on the American political religious landscape, and what are their ramifications, all according to the historical record, as we approach last week?
Well, thank you for the question. I would say that one moment we have to think about, of course, is the civil rights movement in this country, is the movement for the legal equality of African Americans, and then connected to that also the women's movement as well, women's rights movement. And I think that the ramifications of this are, of course, the very changing nature of citizenship as it relates to African Americans and women. That African Americans are legally citizens now with the rights and privileges of citizenship. But I think the other aspect, especially as it relates to what happened in January 6th, is the way that white supremacy recalibrated itself, or white rage shifted. And so the way that we've understood racism in this country has been so shaped by the outstanding images of the civil rights movement. But that white supremacy has now changed and shifted in response to the African American civil rights movement and the women's movement. And I think that has been so significant, both in the shaping of the religious right, the shaping of the right in general, and what some want to call the far right. I prefer to use the phrase the hard right, because I think it shows the connection between those on the right a little better than just saying the far right. So I think the civil rights movement is the most significant aspect, I would argue, and connected to that, the women's movement as well, for American religious history, that it might help us understand what's happening today.
Okay. And the rest of the panelists with this question, just go ahead and chime in when you'd like. I won't sort of go through the list.
I'm happy to chime in next. And my next statements are hardly exhaustive of the historic record and the many milestones. But I want to say, since you gave us 1960 as a kind of starting date for this conversation, I think that the early 60s provided some really important moments in time when the religious landscape began to change. And yes, I mean, obviously the civil rights movement, is again at the very top of the list. But for the first time, the election of a Catholic president, and in a way, it sort of eased what was again, a defining characteristic of American society was Protestant antipathy towards Catholicism. And so over the course of the years from 1960 till January 6th is in fact the way in which those two lost, the divide was lost. And Catholics and I like hard right, the Protestant right, were able to reconcile over those issues. So I think 1960 really is a really important point in that moment. Also, the banning of school prayer in 1962. Suddenly, what had been the rule, you could have a non-denominational prayer in school, that's now out. And for some chunk of the American Christian population, that was their line in the sand. We've got to organize against that. And I'm just going to throw in one or two other things from the 1960s. obviously we have the Cold War and the struggle between godless communism and religious America. Okay, becomes again so potent, and the campus revolts of the 1960s and the liberation, part of which was, in fact, the vast spread of Campus Crusade for Christ. Under the radar, everybody thought of that moment in time about SDS and the left, but in fact, it was Campus Crusade for Christ that really had the lasting impact of changing the rules.
Great, Hasia, thank you. Marie, you seem to be nodding her head. What are your thoughts?
Sorry. Yeah, no, I just to echo, I think I agree with everything that's been said. And just to add a couple of additional, some of the really important historical people are Phyllis Schlafly and Jerry Falwell in the stories that Lerone and Hasia are describing. And both in terms of creating a strong backlash to the civil rights movement, which Falwell was very much a part of his movement, and also the backlash to the women's movement and to abortion rights, which Phyllis Schlafly really spearheaded. Schlafly was a Catholic. Jerry Falwell was a fundamentalist Protestant. And the alliance between them and the movements that they co-created is a perfect example of what Hasia is describing as the end of the kind of old-time anti-Catholicism among Protestants of all kinds, liberal and conservative alike, and new alliances based on gender and sexuality politics. So I think that's critical, and that racial politics were a critical part of that all along the way. We've tended to read the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement and the backlashes against both of them separately. And I think we have to see them together. And I think they both didn't culminate, unfortunately, but for the moment it's culminated in January 6th because those politics were both very visible there.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I'm sorry. I would just add to that in terms of, thinking about, I'm always thinking about, Chris, the history of the present. And we think about what just went on with Georgia, and think about Stacey Abrams, and think about grassroots mobilizing. I'm just going to kind of echo what was already been said. Think about the likes of the grassroots organizing with SNCC in the civil rights movement. You think about the Ella Bakers, Fannie Lou Hamers, and women at the forefront of an organizing tradition that, had a powerful political impact that we're seeing sort of Stacey Abrams and other women on the ground in Georgia continuing today. Okay.
Thanks for that, Jamil. Amy.
I would add just a couple things on that timeline that the panelists have begun to shift out here. In the 60s, a couple more things that I think help us. We've been sort of talking about this sort of movement away from sort of a focus on white Protestantism and making things more pluralistic. So we have two things. The 1965 Immigration Reform Act is an important one because, as we know, the history of immigration has often been a history of closing off. And with that, we begin to see wider immigration, particularly from Asia, and we begin to see a wider range of religions represented more broadly in the United States. So I think that's a piece of the pluralism. Another piece is the Second Vatican Council of 1965, very important. We have the election of Kennedy and all the tension there, but then we have Vatican II, the Declaration on Religious Liberty that changes fundamentally the understanding for the Catholic parishioner about their role in politics and gives a lot more freedom. And so we begin to see and I think part of, as Marie was talking about, how we begin to see the alliance between Protestants and Catholics, particularly people like Phyllis Schlafly being a part of that, those alliances are perhaps engendered in part by the opportunities that come through Vatican II. I would also note, as we move toward the end, you said to about 1990, as we get into the 70s and in particular in the 80s, the emergence of the Christian right is an important piece in our timeline as a coalesced group, primarily Protestant, but not exclusively Protestant. That the coalescing of that group is important. And then also, it's not just that we begin to see the Christian right emerge and leaders emerge in that movement, but we begin to see the Republican Party look and see the Christian right available as an opportunity to partner. And this has always been the case, that we've seen political parties reaching out to religious groups. This is part of American history, but there we have in the 80s that's solidifying. It's not to say that every conservative Protestant is a part of the Christian right, nor that they were, but the Republican Party realizes if they reach out to this group, they can build a key voting bloc, and they use that to moving forward.
Can you or anyone else tell us a little bit more about what the ramifications have been on this religious political landscape of the 1965 Immigration Reform Act? It seems, from my perspective, to have quite a large, or can have quite a large ramification because of the influx of non-Christian religions and their growth here. How significant is this?
Well, I think
non-Christian or Jewish.
I think the influx of Muslims. Okay, even though it's still a very tiny part of the population, however, I think really sent shockwaves through the white American population, that the United States, that this third religion was coming in, and there had been over a century of rapprochement, as it were, between Judaism and Christianity, messy, but still a kind of emergence of an American Judaism that kind of appeared fairly Christian, and to have Muslims come in at a moment in time where, in fact, the Muslim world was being convulsed by its own political and religious struggles, and as part of that, the 1967 war in the Middle East and the kind of letting out of the kind of Pandora's box, the eschatological view that this was the beginning of the end of days and the restoration, and among Jews as well as Christians, that the war was the beginning of the steps towards some kind of second coming, and Muslims as the enemies. So I think the 65 Act allowed, by expanding the Muslim population in the United States, was terribly important in the kind of sense of dread among white Christian Americans that the country that was ours, is being taken away. And then 9/11 had to be a kind of really powerful shock.
Okay. I also wanted to follow up on one thing that Amy mentioned as well, and that's Vatican II. Does anybody, Lerone or Jamil or Marie, have any thoughts on the effect of that on the American religious political landscape, its significance? Marie, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we know now Vatican II did, so of course Vatican II was seen on the conservative side as a sort of liberalization of the Catholic Church, and it was not universally accepted and still isn't. And, one way to think about Vatican II, on the one hand, it opens up church participation to lay people, more kinds of leadership roles, even for women, even if they're unofficial, they're not priests, of course, and really opened up the Catholic Church in a sort of modernizing way. But a lot of more conservative Catholics did not like that and really saw it as anti-Catholic and against the tradition. And so you've kind of created a war at this point that sort of grew through that. Unintended by Vatican II, of course, but this war has emerged among Catholics themselves over the true meaning of the faith and what it means to be a faithful Catholic and what it means to be a voting Catholic in America. Because, of course, Roe v. Wade occurred a few years later in 1973 and instantly decriminalized abortion. And while the vast majority of Americans had wanted some degree of abortion reform before Roe v. Wade, the backlash to that really galvanized Catholics and Protestants on both sides, the pro-life and the pro-choice side. And we've seen the devastating impact, I think, on our politics since then. So Vatican II, of course, is separate from Roe v. Wade, but it did kind of create this divide that I think has been a critical part of the story that we're all trying to tell, and the timelines that we've laid out here.
Okay.
Yeah, and we just saw it with the Biden debate too as well. I mean, this is what Biden was catching in terms of the split in the Catholic vote or the Catholic support for his presidency. And I'll just stop there.
And I would only add, connected to what Marie and Jamila have just said, I think with Vatican II, I think from the Protestant point of view, as these political issues are moving Catholics and Protestants on the right in a cooperative manner, I think what Vatican II also does, to Marie's point, is it also helps to demystify Catholicism for Protestants, right? The Mass is no longer in Latin. The priest is now facing the congregation as opposed to when he's serving the Eucharist, as opposed to when it's back to the congregation. And I think these sort of modernizing measures helps to demystify Catholicism in some way for American Protestants, which then further allows them to see Catholics as teammates, if you will, for the cause of a traditional America. So I think Vatican II helps to aid that process.
Okay. Before we leave this generation between 1960 and 1990, what about the Vietnam War? Did it have what sort of ramifications on the American religious political landscape did that have, if any? I just wanted to bring that up since it was such a large milestone and event in American history.
Well, I'll say something really quickly about that as it relates to the civil rights movement, and that when Martin Luther King finally, as one of the icons of the American civil rights movement, takes his stand officially, most prominently in April 4th of 1967 at Riverside Church in New York. When he takes his stand against the Vietnam War, there does seem to be a moment where the civil rights movement is turning towards other issues, especially for issues about what's happening abroad, and bringing the human rights question to the fore as well. And when King does that, he quickly becomes one of the most unpopular people in the United States. People see him as going far too to the left. LBJ no longer wants to speak to him anymore. King does not have entree into the White House as he did previously. And so as it relates to the Vietnam War, it really becomes a moment where King is trying to bring the peace movement and the civil rights movement together. And there are many folks on the left and the right who see this as political, for lack of a better phrase, political suicide. And this is a really, really, really pivotal moment as King loses some of his political clout, political traction, and tries to join with Catholics and Protestants who are against the war. And at this moment, we see the civil rights movement. Many would argue this is the beginning of the end of the modern civil rights movement because of this stand that King comes out against the Vietnam War.
Okay.
Let me also suggest that the dismal showing of the United States in that war, and then a series of failures, in a way culminating in the Iran hostage moment, was a kind of symbol, or it wasn't a symbol, it was actually quite real, of the decline of the United States. And for those people, again, I think the people we saw January 6th on the Capitol, this was our country when we had it. When we white Christians had it, we were a forceful power, but we let in these Blacks, we let in these women, we let in all, and they have taken away America from us. And this begins with that failure in Vietnam. So I think in a way it's the failure of the war, the military defeat, combined with the involvement of so many religious leaders on the left in the anti-war movement, the nuns, the priests, the rabbis, the ministers, that drove home to the white conservative Christian swath of America we've got to fight for this country.
Okay. Last question before we leave, I guess. This is the last question. Hasia mentioned, I think, end of days theology. So as the country, well, I mean, I don't know if this is fair, but as 2000 approached, but I think there were other events and things that were happening. What was going on this landscape with regards to end of days theology? Did that have a significant impact on America through its believers? Anybody want to answer that? What are your thoughts? Is it significant? Lerone. Marie.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please go ahead. I'll follow up, Marie.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you, Lerone.
That's okay.
I was just going to say quickly, I think some of the research that I did early in my career was among sort of end times theology, women in particular, and parachurch organizations that were preaching this. And at the time, I think I was somewhat blind, sorry to say, to the impact that had on their politics, because, and obviously we know this from history, there's been a lot of end times groups in U.S. history, religious groups. And if you truly believe that not only that the world is about to end, but that you play a role in that eschatological vision, and that you are God's foot soldiers in this battle, to ultimately help bring Jesus back to earth, or whatever the eschatological vision may be. I mean, that's a purpose, and there's an urgency to that. And I think we did see a lot of that actually on January 6th. We know now that was sort of part of this vision of we are bringing about the end of days with
That's
God.
Right. That's right.
So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, and that's perfect. Because what I was going to add to that was that, so you do have that, the foot soldier. We are, God is using us to bring about the end of days. Then you've got the other side that says, why even bother getting involved in politics when the world's going to end anyway? So a famous quote that I like to use for my students is Dwight Moody in the 19th century has this quote where he basically says, God gave him a boat and told him to go out and just save as many as you can, right? Don't worry about the world, because the world's going to end in fire anyway, right? So there's an end of times theology that also can motivate folks to disengage in a certain way from politics and just focus strictly on evangelism and proselytizing, because the world's going to end anyway. Why should we waste time trying to reform a ship that is sinking, right? So let's just focus on evangelism. So I think it's a perfect complement to what Marie said. You have folks who are motivated to do what happened at the Capitol the other day, to bring about this fullness of time. Then you have other folks who sit back and say, I'm not going to get involved in anything political. I just want to save souls.
Amy?
I would just add to that,
thanks, Lerone,
that there's such diversity of views within Christianity about eschatology. And so we're talking about different groups. There's yet another group that would say we need to bring about this end times, and our progressive action is going to be what helps usher in the second kingdom. So I think we've seen eschatology in large and in small ways have an important place in American politics, but I guess I would step back a little bit and just to say, I don't think that this is something that it definitely isn't something that animates every Christian in the same way. And I wouldn't say that it is a part of the political vision of all Christians who are involved in politics. It's part of the political vision of some Christians who are involved in politics, and then some cultural Christians who are involved in politics.
Okay, fair enough. Well, we're going to leave that 30-year period and move to the next, inching ever closer to January 6th. But before we do, I just wanted to remind viewers, in expressing our thanks, please go to download.storyofamericanreligion.org for a free gift that captures a towering national figure in 20th century American history, and one who occupies an important place in the story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion. By the way, I should say, in our discussion about the 60s through the 90s, I was getting worried that we were just going to focus on the 60s. I'm like, hey, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. Didn't we do something of relevance on this religious political landscape? But we did. So we all of you, I thank you for your discussions. I think we covered a lot in those 30 years. So now let's move on here. Same question, so I'll just read it again. What are the most significant events, or some of the most significant events and movements on the American religious political landscape between 1990, now between 1990 and 2021, and what are their ramifications? Again, according to the historical record. Let's begin with Jamil, if he's ready, and he can start us off there.
No, thank you for this question. I wish that I was, last, so I could just piggyback off of my esteemed panelist here. But
I put you on the spot.
No, it's all right, Chris. I will say this, though, that, and maybe it's coming from the 60s, but it still has a sort of powerful moment in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. I'm thinking about the cultural wars, that was sort of in some ways still at play in the 90s. I'm thinking about when Al Gore ran, and even when I think Bill Clinton also ran too, where these sort of central values of, the kind of heteronormative family, the values of, because it was a fight for the soul of America that we hear now, right? And this soul of America, I mean, America's so in some ways moralistic in a way. It's always thinking about, these a moral kind of comportment in terms of what it means to be an American. And so that has to do with like family, right? We think about law and order. We think about, of course, Nixon gets elected in 1969, but I'm thinking about, Nixon, Reagan, and I'm even thinking about the welfare reforms of a Bill Clinton, right? That in some ways demonizes the Black poor. So in today's case, when we think about the working class, we only think about white people because Black people are too lazy. They're too susceptible to crime. And so I think this is in some ways kind of like the trace, if you will, or the trace, if you will, of the kind of the cultural wars that still animates our politics as we saw in Georgia today.
Thanks,
I'm sure
Jamil.
I have more to say after my colleagues.
Sure.
Just piggyback off of them. Yeah.
Murray.
Sure. Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. The culture wars are really crucial. And when I think of the 1990s, I mean, there's a lot that happened in that decade. I think of it as the decade of the sexual harassment wars, because you've got Clarence Thomas nominated to the Supreme Court in 1994. And then the Anita Hill accusations come to light. And that was the event of 1994 in October. And of course, Thomas was narrowly confirmed in the end and still sits on the court. But that was sort of a kind of national debate that we had about sexual harassment. 2 years later, Paula Jones comes forward with accusations against Bill Clinton. And for the rest of the 1990s, we've got Ken Starr and the Starr Report, and then Monica Lewinsky, and all of this comes up. And Christians were very much a part of these debates. I mean, when you look on the ground at the parties who were supporting Thomas and then who were supporting Paula Jones on the other side of a sexual harassment debate, it really galvanized a lot of conservative evangelicals in particular. Catholics weren't such as players in that debate, but you have a lot of folks who had also been animated by abortion and also been animated by other issues being galvanized around these kinds of things. So there's a lot else to say about the 1990s, but that's a really critical part of those culture wars and the building of those movements and the counter movements on the other side too.
Okay. Hasi, anything to say here on?
Yeah, I want to, in a way, just a little bit expand on that. And, the 1990s also saw a kind of efflorescence of rhetoric and then action around the idea of my feelings, my identity, my what offends me, and the development of a kind of public culture that says, you shouldn't have to be offended in public. And now, on the one hand, in interpersonals, that's one thing. But when it becomes the cake bakers who say it offends my religion to bake a cake for a gay couple, or a pharmacist who says it offends my religion to dispense contraception, and the fact that the courts, I think really since the 90s, have been endorsing that kind of right to not be offended. And not that I say this as an advocate for offense, because I think I'm kind of pretty much a nice person and I never want to offend anybody. directly, but the way in which the society has moved towards making such religious proclivity, feelings on the part of the individual a matter for public policy, I think I see that as a legacy of the 90s. And to me, the 90s really ends with 9/11. And again, I think that is just such a major, actually, if I can even go back a little bit before that, in Waco and Ruby Ridge, and the idea that these groups emerge as anti-state and they take up arms against the state. I think we saw that embodied last week.
Lerone.
Yeah,
Thank you, Hasia.
Thank you, Hasi. I'll add to that. I think one through line, as I was listening to all my colleagues, and I agree with everything they said, one through line that would connect us all is the rise of the internet, the World Wide Web, social media. I think that this is one way we could connect a number of these things, whether it's connecting the folks like at Ruby Ridge, and Timothy McVeigh. These folks begin to go online and form an internet community that is across the country to communicate to one another about their white nationalist ideas and anti-state ideas. In the White House, we have, when we get to President Obama, he's the first president really to be tweeting in an active way, and how the internet even helps galvanize white rage against the election of the first non-white president. So I think the internet, the rise of the World Wide Web and social media from 1990 to 2021, where we are today, is also a place where we can see a number of these issues coming together, and how communication changes the speed at which people can talk to one another, breaks down the barriers of time and space, and really helps to organize folks for a number of purposes. And so I think thinking about the internet and the World Wide Web, at cell phones, et cetera, would be an interesting place to start.
Thanks, Lerone. Amy?
To pick up on that and then add a couple more things to our timeline, the rise of the internet, obviously super important, but at the same time, sort of the rise of partisan, and then I would say hyper-partisan media. And we begin to see the internet's making this more possible. So now people are able to choose the information that they receive, and we begin to see the media environment expanding. So it's no longer our lovely 4 networks, but now we have all of these choices, and we can choose to follow information sources that agree with our views. So I think that definitely plays in as well. A couple other things, I have to sort of be the wonky political scientist here, that I think actually are useful to add in. One, talking about the media, we begin to see a lot of more news media reporting about religious groups and voting. As I've said, there's always been a connection, I think, between religious groups and voting in certain ways, but now this kind of becomes part of the story. So there's a lot more discussion, and there's a lot more, if you're a white evangelical, you're a Republican, if you're a Black Protestant, you're a Democrat. They don't talk so much about the fact that Catholics and mainline Protestants are actually kind of in between, but the simplification, as if every white evangelical is Republican, as if every Black Protestant is Democrat. It's not accurate. It does show trends, and these are important voting blocks, but it sort of becomes, we're taught through our media that we're supposed to make these connections. And for many people, it may not even be a religious belief as much as it's just sort of a religious connection. I guess if I have to, I don't actually attend any religious services, but I guess I'm Christian, so I'm supposed to think this. That kind of connection, I think, can be problematic. Another piece that's happening, this is more, I think, kind of moving from the 90s more into the early 2000s and into closer to the present day, is the rise of what we call the nones, the NONES, those who do not adhere to a particular religion. I think if we were to be able to look back through American history, we would see that there often have been an important sized group of people in the United States who are not distinctly religious, but it's becoming more, I think it's becoming more socially accepted to say that you aren't religious. And so as we begin sort of calculating this, by the time we get toward the present day, about somewhere between, depending on how you measure it, 20 to 25% of Americans would describe themselves as not religious, secular. There are different words that can be used. And that's an important voting group too, if you will. That's an important group of people with their expression sort of entering into the conversation. So I think we all have to add those to the conversation.
Thanks, Amy. I wanted to ask you something about what you said, but let's go to Lerone, who raised his hand. Lerone, what's your...
Yeah, I would just add that I think this idea of political capture, to use that phrase, of white evangelicals into the Republican Party, I think that is an increasingly an important idea as we think about our politics. But I think it's important to point out that that idea of political capture is not something that's just being driven by an outside media. But that is something that's also being driven within white evangelicalism itself, in that the folks who occupy some of the largest, well-resourced institutions of white evangelicalism are actually tell people this, right? Some of them actually say, well, if you are a white evangelical and if you really love Jesus, then you will vote this way. And I think that that's important, whether we're talking about universities, churches, news media that's driven by white evangelical communities. We're talking about the 700 Club, Christian Broadcasting Network, and others. And as my colleague Marie has often said, some of the folks who maybe don't have the most resources, but are the loudest for whatever reason it may be, often are a megaphone for, if you are a white evangelical, then you need to vote this way. So I think it's important to point out this idea of political capture is not something that is just imposed from the outside of white evangelicals, but actually is within the evangelical community itself.
Thanks, Lerone. Murray, please.
First of all, I want to issue a correction, and someone caught me on this, and you're absolutely right that Thomas was confirmed in 1991 prior to Clinton. So I apologize. I got my dates messed up there. But going back to this really important point, you know, I grew up in the 70s and 80s too, Chris, and I grew up Southern Baptist in the era when the Southern Baptists were, depending on your perspective, either being taken over by the fundamentalists or having a conservative resurgence. But in my childhood in the 70s, people's political affiliation was all over the map. I mean, even in the South, even in the Bible Belt. And there are historical reasons for that in the Democratic Party in the South and all of that. But it really was still allowable to be a kind of liberal and a Southern Baptist to conservative evangelical Christian. And I think what Amy and Lerone are both pointing to is the kind of funneling down of that. And Amy, you're absolutely right. That's not matching what's always on the ground. There's still plenty of, you know, more liberal evangelical Christians. And I hear you on that. But that I think Lerone is also right that it became increasingly difficult to out oneself as that in certain circles. And so we are always, I know we're talking in generalizations about very specific populations, but I think trend-wise and in terms of the weaponization of religion by the Republican Party, which is how I see it. I mean, that people really, they came to see that they could capture a lot of those folks. That's been a really important trend. And then I just want to bring back 9/11, which Hasia brought up earlier, of course, because we're talking around that, but that's sort of the critical event of 2001 that just changes everything, you know, from there. I mean, it doesn't change everything, but just becomes the kind of focus. And you've got George W. Bush, a very open conservative evangelical president in the White House at that time. And I think so much coalesced around that really, I would say, intensified the trends that we're describing here in all kinds of very important ways.
Thank you, Marie. Hasia.
Yeah, I just want to continue one little line of conversation and then just add another one. I mean, I think one of the impacts of the new media, be it the internet or this proliferation of sites, networks, is that nobody has to listen to anybody develop a middle of the road position. And gone are the days of like Walter Cronkite, or, you know, who spoke in a kind of everyman. I mean, obviously we could dissect Cronkite's rhetoric and find it wasn't really everyman, but it was pitching to the middle. Whereas now one can get one's news only from and then just name whatever the site is in terms of politics, religion, ethnicity. And therefore, I see this going hand in hand with the kind of dissolution of a belief in a kind of liberal common culture. And I think that going back to one of your early questions about rules, I think that that kind of civic common culture, for all of its kind of flaws and its whiteness and its maleness, still, however, was the generator of rules of civility.
Okay.
And that's all gone. And I just want to throw out, and we don't have to spend any more time on it, is we've talked about Christians, we've said a little bit about Muslims, but I mean, there's a revolution that's taken place in the world of American Judaism, in which the Orthodox, who are growing in number, have now found common cause with the Christian right. Okay. And there were on the little bit I couldn't watch too much of January 6th. I have a very low tolerance for being upset, but I saw flags with the Star of David on it. And it's this fusion of Zionism with the Christian evangelical movement, which is, again, a really post-1970s phenomenon, gaining steam in the 90s and 2000s. And that too has transformed the religious political landscape of American Judaism.
I'm glad you brought that up, Hasia. Thank you. Lerone, you had your hand up. You wanted to say something.
I was just going to comment. I appreciate you bringing that up, Hasia. And that is, you talk about rules. And one of the places we can locate this is in the 80s about the rise of one-sided media or niche or a media that is pitched to a particular market or a particular religious and political viewpoint, is the whittling down of the fairness doctrine and the whittling down of the equal time doctrine. And as these things are whittled down, people like Rupert Murdoch are at the forefront of pushing this and saying the free market now provides so many opportunities through new media, through television, through cable. Why should we have to be governed by these silly ideas of being fair and equal time? Let the consumer choose. And Rupert Murdoch is at the forefront of some of those lawsuits in the 80s to whittling down this idea. And so now we have this media marketplace of what we have today. As my dear colleague said, you can now choose whatever worldview you want to have, whether it's MSNBC, Fox, or CNN, or ONA, and the list continues. And I think finding Rupert Murdoch there at the forefront there is important about how the FCC allows for some of this to happen.
Thank you, Lerone. You're going to have the last word on that, bringing us up to January 6, 2021. And the time doesn't allow us to get to January 6, 2021 in the level of detail that I think our listeners need, but we've attempted it. We've given them some important information I think will be helpful. I have a last question for each of you. And I think will be very helpful because we've heard a lot of things about the American political and religious landscape, which are super helpful. But now I want to sort of have you coalesce that into sort of a statement. And here's how I'm going to ask the question. And we'll begin, to give you a few minutes as I read this, we'll begin with Amy, if we could, to answer this. Okay. So if what I'm calling the American religious political historical record were a person, what would he or she say? Not you, but what would the record say about why January 6, 2021 happened? If you need a second to think, but I'll read it one more time. If the American religious political historical record were a person, what would he or she say about why January 6, 2021 happened? Amy.
I think the historical record would say this is a point that's going to be on our timeline, that we will look back at this as an historical moment. I think the historical record would also say this is a point where we can see when the ramifications of extreme views. I don't think we're going to look back on this and say, see, this is what all of these conservatives thought, because what happened, the storming of the Capitol, was not a mainstream expression, but it was an expression of the extremes and the rage. And it showed us rage beyond any question. We can no longer say this is a neutral movement. We can say at the extremes, this movement is dangerous.
Okay, thank you. Hasia?
I think that this person, this hypothetical person, would in fact put first blame on Trump. And the problem with that is that it personifies something that has much deeper and broader and pernicious roots. The people who stormed the Capitol have always been with us, but it did in fact take a figure who was able to galvanize, to bring it out from under the rocks, okay, and to put them on buses and planes to come to Washington. And the problem is to associate it only with the top, when in fact the roots are deep.
Thank you. Jamil?
Yeah, I would just kind of echo. I think the person would say what, Amiri Baraka said. It's the kind of changing same, where still in some ways, white supremacy, male supremacy still governs the soul of, American politics, but also the soul of American religion. And in one way would also say, let's not, scapegoat lower class whites. And let's also, talking back to Anderson Cooper and others, let's look at the CEOs. Let's look at the lawyers. Let's look at the college educated people who also stormed the Capitol too. So we don't just relegate this as a fringe movement, but at the same time, this is at the center of American politics. This is at the center of American religion. And, the echoes of the past, America's buried corpses, they're speaking today and showing us telling us this is the changing same. And this is the center of America, this terror and this violence by the lower class, but also people who are at the upper professional upper classes, like those in the KKK in the 1920s.
Jamil, thank you. Lerone?
In my story, this person says the chickens have come home to roost. That's what my person says. And that you've watched folks who are now coming out saying that this, what happened, is horrible. We can't believe this happened. Everybody from Mick Mulvaney is like, I can't imagine how this happened, right? The former chief of staff for the president, Pat Robertson, Robert Jeffress, all these other folks, and even folks like Mitch McConnell and others. But you say, you all didn't say a whole lot from the very beginning, when the president launched his campaign talking about our dear Latinx brothers and sisters, when he said his inauguration was the largest in American history. No one said a whole lot about that. They just let it fly as alternative facts. But now that all that violence and lies has been sowed, and now that it's time for the reaping to come, now that Mitch McConnell and others found themselves in danger, right? It was no longer just Black Lives Matter protesters in the street, Antifa folks in the street, but now that it actually reached their doorstep, and now that they were in danger, right? Became very close, not for an African-American police officer, drawing a bunch of folks away from the Senate chambers, literally by the second, we would have had a different story. But now that violence has come to their doorstep, now it's time to do something, right? Now Mitch McConnell is actually considering whether or not, to lead his party to vote for the president to actually be convicted and to be impeached. So my person would say this is a story that chickens have come home to roost. And now we've got to figure out, now that this is where we are, what are we going to do? Are we going to have just a moment of reckoning that's going to be filled with platitudes to make us all feel good and make sure we're on the right side of history? Or are we actually going to do the work to make sure that we do not allow this to happen again? But it's going to be very difficult, because now that this genie is out of the bottle, it's going to be very difficult to put this genie back in.
Thanks, Lerone. Marie, I think you're going to have the last word here.
Well, I agree with these wonderful points everyone has made, and so I'll just add a few words. I'm here in the state of Missouri, as Lerone is, and Josh Hawley is our senator. Amy is in the state just across the river from us, which feels like a world away in many ways, although it's not really. I think part of what Josh Hawley exemplifies, because he's not unique, he is exemplary of an impulse in politics that has been allowed to grow, that has allowed people's own realities to be distorted, and for politicians to underline and reinforce and confirm these dramatically deceptive, distorted views that people are having of U.S. history and their own history. And part of that is a persecution narrative that's been allowed to flourish. So someone pointed out in the chat box a few minutes ago, one of our listeners, that white supremacists see themselves as persecuted. They see themselves as the victims. They do not see African Americans as victims of slavery and Jim Crow racism and everything else that we've been describing. They see themselves as victims, and the politicians have fueled that and exacerbated that in all kinds of ways for their own political ends, and weaponizing this. And a kind of superhero narrative has emerged on the hard right that has allowed people to think that if they amass enough guns, they can sort of save the day. And I think part of that siege on the Capitol was about being superheroes, wanting to be superheroes and save themselves and save the nation. And until we go back to a truth-based politics, even disagreeing and debating as we will, because we will still have conflict, but not allowing these lies to flourish in the media landscape that has been described, and in politics, I think, this movement is only going to grow. This is not going to be the culmination. That's what frightens me. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Marie, I have one question for you, then we're going to go to Amy, who wants to say one thing in closing. Marie, is religion, based on your understanding of the historical record, should religion be part of the solution of America's challenges going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't see religion as inherently good or inherently evil. I think that it has inspired the best and the worst behavior in people, and it always does. But at its best, you also see people of faith, Jews, Christians, Muslims, people, and secularists too, who are doing the good work of telling the truth, and focusing on education and on all kinds of ways that we can move beyond this. So religion has a crucial positive role to play in all of this, for sure.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Last word.
And I was just going to say, kind of bring a little of these things together. I think we may see in the historical record that January 6th becomes a day when the Republican Party splits. I think that's very possible, and that these religious alliances will go in different directions. We're already seeing very different responses, particularly within the religious community. So I think this might be the beginning of that hard work that Lerone mentioned that needs to happen to move us forward in a better place. Thanks, Amy.
Viewers, I want to remind you again, as a thank you for joining us this morning, please go to download.storyofamericanreligion.org for a free gift that captures a towering national figure on the American religious political landscape, and one who occupies an important place in the story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion. Again, as well, we do see questions, and we will answer those via email. Panelists, thank you so much for the insights you shared today. They have already been helpful to me as I process the violent occupation of the United States Capitol on January 6th, 2021. I appreciate each of you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks so much, and thanks to all my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Learned a lot. Thank you, Chris, for the invitation.
A pleasure to meet you all.
Absolutely.
It's really fabulous.
Thanks, everybody.
The podcast series, Religion in the American Experience, is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes are released each Monday on Apple Podcast and Spotify. Register for notifications on our website, www.storyofamericanreligion.org under the Sign Up tab.